everyone. Welcome to the special session today, Finding Security, U.S. China Ag Trade in a Changing World. My name is Mimi Fan. I'm the Executive Director of U.S. Heartland China Association. We're a 501c3 nonprofit committed to promoting exchanges between U.S. and China through agriculture, education, culture, and business. And we want to thank the Ford Foundation and Henry Luce Foundation for their support to make this program possible. And throughout the program, please feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to answer all your questions. And also at the end, please give us your feedback through a very quick survey. Before we get started today, I'd like to welcome 3 leaders of our nonprofit to give brief opening remarks. First, we have Ambassador Kenneth Quinn, Strategic Advisor of U.S. Heartland China Association, President Emeritus of World Food Prize, and former Ambassador to Cambodia. Ambassador Quinn.
Min, thank you. Good morning to everyone in China, and good evening to everyone joining in the United States and North America. I'm speaking to you from Des Moines, Iowa, in the Heartland. And if you can see behind me is the World Food Prize Hall of Laureates, where in February of 2012, I had the great privilege and honor to welcome then Vice President Xi Jinping when he arrived to give the keynote address at the U.S. China High-Level Agricultural Symposium. It was an incredible day. In addition to hearing from Vice President Xi, there was a memorandum signed on strategic cooperation in agriculture and contract signed for $3.5 billion of American soybean exports to China. It was just one of the very top and best days of the entire Sino-American relationship since diplomatic relations were established. But now, just 10 years later, we have this terribly worrisome period where with controversy over Taiwan, there are public statements being made about possible conflict between the United States and China. And therefore, this forum tonight on finding security, U.S.-China agricultural trade in a changing world could not be more perfectly timed, because it's essential that we find ways to defuse this situation, prevent violence, and move in a positive direction for our relations. And this, as we've seen again and again, can best be done through agriculture. And it's essential that we find a way to do this, not just for the fate of people on Taiwan, or for the fate of the people in the United States and China, but for the fate of the entire human race. Because as these events are taking place, at the same time, our planet faces the single greatest challenge in all human history. Can we sustainably and nutritiously feed the 9 to 10 billion people who will be on our planet by the year 2047? And in order to do that, there are 2 factors that are absolutely essential. One is that China and the United States need to find ways to cooperate in research, in rural development, and in implementation around the world. And the second is that the US and China must remain at peace. We've already seen from the Ukraine and Russia and that terrible conflict what the impact is in Africa, where commodities and food supplies are now in much shorter supply. Prices are high. Global food prices are escalating. Imagine what would happen if there was another similar conflict in Asia. Now, to meet this challenge, the U.S. Heartland China Association, in collaboration with marvelous partners, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, China Agricultural University, other Chinese non-governmental entities, have sponsored a series of agricultural roundtables. We had a U.S. China agricultural dialogue just on April 21st, again, here in Des Moines, Iowa, with three ambassadors, Ambassador Chen Gang, Ambassador Nicholas Burns, and former American Ambassador Terry Branstad, all participating, all in a positive way, all discussing about agriculture. And so as we move ahead tonight, I noticed that during all of the most intense exchanges on August the 4th in the People's Daily, they ran a story, had a quote from me about welcoming Vice President Xi to Des Moines in 2012 for that event. And it talked about how President Xi understands farmers and understands rural development from his historic connection to Iowa. And so I took that as a sign that the way that our two countries can find our way forward to maintaining peace for the world, maybe won't be through capitals like in Washington or Beijing, but it will be in the American heartland in places like Des Moines, Iowa.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Quinn, for your wonderful remarks. Next, I'd like to welcome remarks from Susan Thornton, also our board member, currently senior fellow at Poutside China Center at Yale Law School, and formerly with the State Department in the capacity of acting assistant secretary of Eastern Asia Affairs. Susan?
Well, thank you, Min, and it's really great to be here with all of you tonight and to talk about, our continuing interest in keeping up the relationship between the heartland of America and the heartland of China. I have spent the past 20 years or so working on the U.S. China relationship, mostly in government, but some out of government. And in government, mostly at the State Department. I spent 7 years in China, and I can attest from my personal experience that during that time, the U.S. and China have worked through many, many difficult moments. Obviously, as Ambassador Quinn mentioned, we have seen some increase in geopolitical tensions between the U.S. and China in recent years, and even in recent weeks. And relationships certainly seem to have become a bit more difficult as I think communication has become more difficult. And there are many reasons for this. I don't think that the US and Chinese governments really see eye to eye on the causes of this kind of increase in tension and deterioration in relations. But I think it's important not to underestimate the profound effect that COVID-19 and the inability to have in-person meetings and real people-to-people connections has had on this relationship and how it's contributed to the deterioration. I think the tensions between the U.S. and China in the relationship are likely to continue, certainly at the official level. And both sides, I think, have set, as Ambassador Quinn said, a priority to avoid military conflict and confrontation. And this has been really a mainstay of the conversations, several of them that President Biden and President Xi Jinping have managed to have over the last year and a half, but even in the last, month or so. So I think it's important to realize that, of course, the U.S. is going to remain firm on our principles. But while we're doing that, and while tensions are in the air between us, it's interesting to note that the trade between, actually across the Taiwan Strait, between Taiwan and the mainland is hitting record highs, just as the trade between the U.S. and China is also hitting record highs. So I think it's important to recognize that even in spite of geopolitical tensions, in spite of the problems and complications that the pandemic has imposed on the relationship and the ability to do that trade, it's still going on. So I'd like just to close by saying that the relationship, excuse me, is multifaceted and complicated. we should remember that the US administration's policy is to compete and cooperate, and whatever we have to do to further American interests. But certainly cooperation is, as Ambassador Quinn alluded to, part of that mix. The Biden administration has said we do not seek a Cold War with China, and we do not seek to decouple our economies. That is impossible. And of course, there are areas of concern like sensitive technologies, military modernization, but many of those are covered by our export control laws, which are constantly being updated, or other trade rules and restrictions, which are part of our legal proceedings, and which all of our businesses can review and abide by in partnering as they feel would be in their interest with Chinese partners. I think the Biden administration has also made clear, even in the wake of the recent tensions over Taiwan, that while the US and China have our differences, we're certainly not going to shy away from expressing our views. But we do have common interests, and we want to protect our societal ties, including our business and our people-to-people relationships. And we will go to bat to protect those ties, even in spite of the ongoing tensions in other areas. And I think this is where you come in, and this is where our organization, the U.S. Heartland China Association, comes in. We want to be a resource and a bridge to make sure that we can sustain these very important societal ties between these two most major powers in the world that are going to be key to our future and the future generations.
Thank you, Susan, for your remarks. Next, I'd like to turn to our chairman and former Governor of Missouri, Bob Holden, for his remarks. Governor Holden.
Thank you, man, and delighted to have everybody with us this evening. Since my time as governor of Missouri and chairman of the Midwest Governors Association, and now as chairman of the United States Heartland China Association, I have been committed to finding ways for the United States Heartland region and China's agricultural provinces to work together. It is in the best interest of both countries and cultures to find ways to work together for the benefit of our global world and communities. Both countries have much to offer. The United States Heartland region is known as the breadbasket of the world. We are the major producer of soybeans, beef, pork, poultry, and many others that are sent to China and around the world. China is the world's largest importer of agricultural products and the world's largest population. Our focus should be to better understand each other, learn from each other, learn about the cultures and the need, if we want to maintain stability, how we can work together for everybody's benefit. This is a relationship that benefits both the United States and our heartland and China. We must look for seeds of opportunity in both countries. That is why these efforts are so important. I look forward to the rest of the program this evening.
Thank you, Governor Holden. And at this point, I will introduce our moderator. Jim Schultz is our board member, also chair of our agriculture committee, and which means he led the U.S. China Ag Roundtable last year and this past year as well, and this year as well. And he is in his full-time day job as chairman, founder of Open Prairie, which he founded in 1999. Jim is a well-known ag business entrepreneur, private equity executive, and also served as the director of the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity in 2015, from 2015 to 2017. He led many missions internationally, including to China, and he serves on many boards, which will take up too much time to introduce. At this point, I'd like to turn to Jim to introduce the panelists and lead us through the rest of the program. Thank you, Jim.
And thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us from China this evening, my friends in China. Good evening. And my friends, good morning, excuse me, my friends in the US, good evening. It's interesting to hear the comments of Ambassador Quinn, Susan Thornton, and Governor Holden. about the issues that we face in food security. And food security sometimes can mean something different to everyone. As I found out many years ago, I talk to food security about how we protect our crops that we grow here on our planet. But food security for most of the people on the planet is about having a food or a meal before them this evening or tomorrow morning. According to the United Nations, they released a report in July that talked about some of the food security issues. And tonight, I hope to focus much of our time on that, and largely following Ambassador Quinn, Governor Holden, Susan Thornton on how we can better collaborate between our countries. And that was the purpose of setting up the U.S. Heartland China Association. But the United Nations in July issued a report called The State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World. And world hunger has risen in 2021 with around 2.3 billion people facing moderate or severe difficulty obtaining enough to eat. On top of that, the number facing severe food insecurity has increased to about 924 million. But both of those numbers are up from before the pandemic. If you put that in context, that means that 1 in 4 people is going to bed tonight malnourished or without adequate food. And that 1 in 9 individuals is facing severe food insecurity. Another interesting statistic that I think that sometimes we lose sight of is that 3.1 million children die annually from malnutrition. That's a startling number. And we as the United States, we as China can find a better path ahead to collaborate to find a solution to that. Just in the few minutes I've been speaking, that means that every 10 seconds, a child is dying of starvation. So a number of children will die tonight from our session that we're in. It's a stunning statistic if you look at it in that perspective. With that, I'm going to now go to introducing the panelists that have agreed to join us tonight. First off is Dr. Yan Dong. She's the Director of Trade Department at the Institute of World Economics and Politics with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Dr. Joseph Glauber is a Senior Research Fellow with the International Food Policy and Research Institute. And then Lee Strom joined us as kind of a pinch hit tonight. One of our panelists came down with COVID, and I reached out to Lee, who's a partner in our private equity fund, and he has an extensive background in both production ag here in the U.S. and also in finance of agricultural businesses around the U.S. So he'll bring a different perspective about what his view is with trade issues as a producer. With that, I'm going to now turn it over to our panelists to begin the evening. Dr. Dong, I'll ask you to lead us off, if you would, and give us some opening comments, please.
Okay, I'll share my slides first.
I think you should be able to share, yes.
Yes, it's okay. It's good? Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm Yan Dong from Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and my topic will discuss about opportunities and challenges about China-US trade. And as we all know that Adam Smith mentioned that international division of labor and free trade leads to efficiency. However, after more than 20 years of hyper-globalization, we are facing a backlash of globalization. So security is an important issue in current trade governance. But maybe one of the most important questions we are facing is how to balance efficiency and security, and how to make a new kind of cooperations under this background. At present, there's a lot of discussion about the discontent about globalization. So what is the optimal level of globalization? Well, for the efficiency concerns, I think maybe this will be the lower bound for the globalization. We all know that if without cooperation, maybe there is now no international cooperation, and I think international cooperation will still remains a strong support for world economic growth and to economic gains. Well, we can go back to the upper bound for the national security concerns will be the upper limit of globalization, as mentioned by the chairs that a great power competition, fragmentation of global value chains, and COVID has raised mixed risks. So the level of economic globalization is no longer rising in one direction, but maybe constantly adjusting and fluctuating. Well, despite many risks and challenges, we can see that in the last 2 years, China and the US has also saw a strong development trend of bilateral trade. That here we have this table. This data is from the latest statistics of the Chinese and General Administration of Customers. In the first half of this year, China's total trade with the world has reached 10.3%, while with the United States, it is still a little higher, that is 12.7%, higher than the average level of China's foreign trade. This has shows a solid foundation for the economic ties between China and the United States. Well, when we go from the perspective of the United States, that's in the United States and China is China's fifth largest source of imports. This is the data from the imports. Well, China's imports from US has raised 3.6% in the first half this year. Well, when we compare with other different regions like the EU, that's China's imports from the EU were negative in the same periods. And also mentioned by the chair that in the last year, bilateral agricultural trade has also reached a record high of 46.4 billion US dollars. So though the economic data of trade has shown some positive signs, but however, we have to objectively speaking that there is a changing paradigm of international policy coordination between China and the United States, that especially the goals, subject, and the mechanism of Sino-US cooperation are in the process of significant changes, especially when for economics. We also saw that cooperation means we can cooperate to gain nice welfare gains and also to internationalizing negative externalities of unilateral actions. But currently, we see under the background of great power competition that may be the objective of cooperation in some of between us has changed, and maybe relative national power will be one of the main objectives. And also as from the competition power, we can see before that we can use the hegemonic stability theory to explain the situation since the World War II. But currently, we see some symmetric economic power competitions and also asymmetric between the mechanism background of different nations. So also the traditional mechanism of cooperation will change. We see that like WTO and other new forms of the reform of WTO and also new form of cooperation are rising. So the development of traditional multilateral trading system is facing a crisis, and so we can have two dimensions to describe the global trading system. One is members, the other is the rules. Well, for the member countries, there is a shift from seeking NATO trading partners based on comparative advantage to friendly or forced choice, like we see the new words of friendly offshoring. And also in the dimension of trade rules have been adjusted from deepening economic cooperation to integrating more security considerations, and especially to incorporate human rights and other political considerations into economic rules. So this will make the structural change of global trading system and make things a little difficult. While from China's side, China has an open and cooperative attitude across the world. And currently, China is in the new development stage of development and also hope to build a new development pattern based on new development philosophy. And so this will provide a lot of opportunities for the world. And especially as mentioned by the speakers, that China is a large country and China's goal is to promote a large domestic market and also such as develop a green economy and promote development of service industry. And in this process, by promoting the opening up of the system, and China hopes to make the market more open, more vital, and hope to cooperate with other countries. So I think that China and the United States still have broad space for cooperation in various fields. But we should also consider that we should considering to find effective mechanism for future cooperation. That these are the following important steps. I think rebuilding the framework of cooperation is very important. That since we mentioned that security is one of the most important issues, that forming a binding and credible commitment between the two sides to reduce the negative effects of unilateral actions, especially during the process when we need to reconstruct mutual trust. And also we need to strengthen cooperation in the area of digital economy, trade, supply chain, climate change, energy and infrastructure, and also to reduce institutional conflicts. And China is now still making a lot of reform actions, especially free trade zones, to make institutional opening up. So above all, I think for China and the United States, strengthening a mutual trust is the basis for cooperation. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Dong. It's very informative, and particularly have a question for you later on the consumer-oriented ag imports that are occurring. But with that, I'll again encourage you to put questions into the Q&A box. Todd Gleason, thank you for your question. We'll get to that later in the presentations. But at this point, I'm going to turn it to Dr. Joseph Glauber to provide some perspective on trade issues. And so, Dr. Glauber.
Thanks very much, Jim. Let me find my presentation here. Okay. Okay, let's hope that advances it. Great. Okay, everyone see that, I presume, Jim?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, great. And thanks so much to the U.S. Heartland China Association to be on this program. I'm really been looking forward to it. I spent many years at the Department of Agriculture prior to my current position at the International Food Policy Research Institute. But at USDA, I was the chief economist. I also was at USTR as a chief trade negotiator during the Doha round. Spent a lot of time both in visiting China and also working with China negotiators and others at the WTO. And so, you know, it's really remarkable, the trading bonds that have formed over the last 20 years Just earlier this year, I was asked to give a paper on the development of the China trade since accession. And I'm going to just go over a few of those slides because I think they're quite fascinating. One is just the tremendous growth we've seen in China imports and exports. I mean, I think a lot of people in the U.S. don't realize that China's the #3 agricultural exporter in the world. They're just, they are, if it weren't for the fact that they import so much, they are now the #1 importer, agricultural importer in the world. And so, but as an exporter, they're quite large as well. And you can just see those sort of growth that in both imports and exports since 2000, when China acceded to the WTO, became a member of the WTO. Here's just an example on China exports. China exports a lot of fruits and vegetables and preparations, essentially processed products that go to a lot of markets, particularly in Asia. We see probably fewer of those in the U.S., but again, very, very important markets. Back in 2000, they also exported a lot of some grains. So they would have exported rice and some other commodities. That's less so now. They tend to be a much larger importer of those commodities. But again, very, very important, particularly in the fruit and vegetable space. Where you really see the big change is on imports. And China has become just an incredible powerhouse in the world in terms of importing agricultural products. Oilseeds was mentioned, how important it is in the U.S. Midwest, and in the fact that in the U.S., I think something like 1 out of every 4 rows of soybeans that are planted, essentially the production from that goes to China. So 25% of U.S. soybean production ends up in China. But also what has grown phenomenally over the last few years in particular is feed grain imports. So China is a very large importer of sorghum, barley, corn, distillery dry grains, any number of products that essentially help them feed their animal industries. They also import a lot of meat, dairy, fruits and vegetables, cotton. Again, you name it, China is a large importer. I used to point out to the Secretary of Agriculture that even something like hides and skins of bovine animals, that was almost $1 billion worth of trade from the U.S. to China. So just phenomenal in terms of importance. And we're not the only country. I think this is the other remarkable thing, is that if you go back to 2000, that China was for the U.S. it was our 7th largest trading partner. For the European Union, the 15th largest. Brazil, the 5th. You just go down this list and you see how insignificant China was as far as an import or export destination for these suppliers. By 2020, of course, they were our #1 destination for almost, or at least in the top 2 or top 5 now for 15 of the largest agricultural suppliers in the world. So they are very, very important. And I think that again, the lessons I would take away from the last 3 or 4 years is that trade wars are very destructive. But thankfully, our markets are very resilient. No sooner than we got a ceasefire in the trade war, that trade started to resume again. China again is our #1 trading partner. And I think that I would echo Dr. Dong's comments that I think the importance of resolving disputes in the WTO and building on the multilateral process and bilateral relationships with China is really something that both of our countries need to put our minds to. And with that, I'll just wait for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Glauber. Appreciate those comments and some great statistics. We might want to refer back to some of those later on during the the panel event today. Just real quick, for those that are joining perhaps for the first time, the U.S. Heartland China Association was founded almost 20 years ago in 2003. So next year will be our 20th anniversary. We are a 501c3, a bipartisan organization committed to building stronger ties between the region, the 20 state regions of the U.S. and the People's Republic of China. Our focus is to build trust and to create efforts to bring government officials, business leaders, educational and community interests with like-minded institutions to think about doing business between the Heartland region and the People's Republic of China. I'd encourage you, if you're not a member, to click on the link at our website in the upper right-hand corner. You can become a member of the USHCA. And if you are inclined, we are a 501c3, so please make a donation and help support a future event or provide grant support. Whatever you can do, help support the cause. We're trying to do this in a bipartisan, friendly way to create more opportunities between our two countries. With that, I'm going to turn to Lee Strom to give some opening comments. Again, Lee, really appreciate you jumping less than 12 hours ago into this slot to be a panelist, and look forward to some of your thoughts and comments on trade and trade policy as a producer and a major person in finance in the ag industry in the U.S. Lee Strom.
Thank you very much, Jim. And it's certainly an honor for me to be a part of this distinguished panel of Dr. Dong and Dr. Glauber. I've had the pleasure of knowing Joe Glauber for most of the last 15, 20 years, because I was in Washington, D.C. at the same time that he was residing as the chief economist at the USDA. I was serving as the CEO of the Farm Credit Administration here in the United States, the largest provider of credit and financial services to the U.S. agriculture production sector. Portfolio of today is about $400 billion portfolio. So while I was in that role, I relied heavily on the information that Dr. Glauber and USDA would share about the economic health issues around trade in the U.S. because it affected the producers directly that we lent money to. So it was a very pertinent topic annually to get USDA and Dr. Glauber's perspectives. But more importantly, I'm an agriculture producer, and while I apologize, I don't have a PowerPoint to share with you. I hope for a few minutes here I can share with you a perspectives of how a producer, because I am a farmer located in northern Illinois on a farm where my family has been since the late 1800s. I'm a third generation. My son is a fourth generation. His son is a fifth generation future farmer, where we raise corn and soybeans and some specialty crops. And trade has always been and will continue to be such an important topic. But let me tell you that this year, 2022, in the 45 years that I have produced a crop, this year undoubtedly is the most unique and volatile of any year that we have experienced here in the United States, and I think globally from an agriculture production sector. Our input costs for production, for items like fertilizer, machinery, other chemicals and pesticides have accelerated tremendously this year. We're paying more per acre for the inputs that we have ever experienced before. So we are very sensitive to the prices for our commodities. And let me just share the importance of the news that we receive as a producer on a daily basis. I woke up this morning. First item I see on the news as I check the overnight markets, and soybeans are down nearly 50 cents, or about 3% in the early trade this morning. And part of the reason given for that was the surprise announcement overnight of the interest rate cut in China. That was some of the commentary pointing to commodity price declines here in the US and abroad because of the concern of how that might indicate a slowdown in the Chinese economy. Now, whether that is true or not, that is an example of the extreme volatility that we see. As a producer, that affects my per acre returns 10 to 15 potential percent, or $30 to $50 per acre on a daily basis, these types of market swings. And it makes it very challenging in this environment, again, as we have high expense cost going into putting a crop in the ground and raising that crop. So while commodity prices are up, our margins are still quite thin. And that concerns me and my fellow producers here in the US as we look to the future, to next year. The production expenses appear to be rather sticky in nature. We think they're going to be around at these highly elevated areas. But we've also seen some lower prices in commodities in reaction to improved weather here in the US. And I understand that Europe is in the middle of they've had several heat waves and a drought in France and other part in Portugal and Spain. But I also read news this morning that in China, you're suffering in certain areas from extreme heat as well. So will that impact your crop as well? Those are all of the things that I watch as a producer. But because I've been a producer for 45 years, let me share another story about the importance of trade. As I mentioned, I put my first crop in the ground when I was 22 years old out of college in 1978. Well, 2 years later, in January of 1980, the United States put an embargo on wheat sales to the Soviet Union. And that lasted for about a year. And during that period, prices went way down. And that was one of the causes of the Great Recession. There were many other causes during that early 1980s period, like high interest rates and other factors. But certainly the threat of embargoes and shutting off trade, or the tariffs that we saw here in recent years during the Trump administration with China, have an immediate and severe impact on a producer. So as I look to navigate the future, obviously from my perspective, open and fair trade. We greatly appreciate, as Dr. Glauber said, that as a soybean producer myself, China buys roughly 25% of the soybeans. That's about 60% of our total U.S. exports of soybeans. And we hope we provide a quality product and will continue to provide that for you. But we're also watching expectations this coming year that Brazil, South America, is going to produce a record crop. And actually last Friday here in the United States, we had our August crop report, which always comes out the second week of August. It's the most anticipated production estimate that USDA provides to the agricultural sector. And it showed that we are expecting a record crop of soybeans in the United States this year, a little north of 4.5 billion bushels. So if you look at that record crop, and a record yield here in the United States, in concert with a potential record crop coming out of South America, what does that foretell in the coming year for soybean prices? And as I look at the opportunity to forward price at historically high prices right now, it is tempting for me as a producer to do that. But again, in the extreme volatile environment that we've been in this year, largely due to the Ukraine conflict, the shutdown of Ukrainian exports up until recently, and we're starting to see a bit of flow of those exports out of Ukraine. Whether that will continue or not, we're not sure. But as Susan Thornton mentioned, the current ongoing issues with Taiwan and the U.S. perspective up against the Chinese perspective of that. Does that future spell a bit of problem for us in trade relations? Again, as a producer, I am watching these developments every day. It's a bit complicated. I've never seen it in 45 years in the US as complicated as the situation right now is. So for US producers, we are very cautious on what the next year or two are going to hold for us. In the soybean area specifically, I also just want to mention, there's continued growth in crushing capacity for soybeans here in the US. The major firms like ADM, Cargill, and others are continuing to expand crushing capacity, particularly in the upper plain states, like in North Dakota, where we raise a lot more soybeans than we did 20 years ago, or when I was a young man, you hardly ever saw a soybean grown in North Dakota. But now with the adaptation of new varieties of soybeans that can tolerate shorter season growth, we grow a lot of soybeans in North Dakota. That crushing capacity is largely targeted toward renewable fuels. And with a number of the climate initiatives that are on the books already and further discussions, we see significant growth in renewable fuel opportunities for soybean oil here in the US. And so we anticipate utilizing more soybeans here in the US for that segment of the market. I saw some estimates last year that if we were to meet the already mandated renewable fuels legislation, and if the airline industry fully embraces next generation renewable fuels for airplanes, we could conceivably grow our domestic demand for soybeans by another 60% or so. Now, Joe Glauber, you may have more accurate numbers on that than I do, but as a producer, we are watching this very closely, and we think the future is very bright for continued growth in soybeans and strong prices going forward. But again, the role of China, you are our biggest soybean importing country for our soybean exports, and we hope to continue to serve your market. I will leave it at that and turn it back to Jim.
Lee, thank you. Appreciate again you jumping in like that and some great insights. I think one of the important things, and I think Susan highlighted this, is on Taiwan. I mean, this is an organization that doesn't hide from the issues. We're going to talk about the issues. It's in all countries' interest to not have conflict, and I think that's part of our responsibility to encourage our leaders to find opportunities to collaborate and not to see conflict divide us. So today's event is an important one toward that end. Joe, I might turn to you to talk a little bit about trade policy and maybe the phase one trade policy and the impact upon a go forward basis, and kind of what your view of the next 12, 24 months might be on phase one and potentially phase two.
Yeah, thanks. Again, I'll let me drop back a little bit and talk about the trade war, because I think that's an important context as well. As I say, we were doing great business with China, and the trade war came, and unfortunately, the trade disputes weren't about agriculture; they were really about other non-ag issues. Personally, I would have rather seen those issues taken to the WTO and argued out there, rather than this sort of unilateral approach that the U.S. took at the time. But unfortunately, agriculture really suffered the collateral damage. And as Lee well remembers, we were scrambling to try to find other markets for soybeans. And we did find some, but we ended up carrying out a lot more soybeans than we thought. And if it weren't for a whole bunch of money provided by the government to compensate farmers who had been hurt by that trade war, I think we would have seen some real sharp farm income declines. I think the main thing, and at the time phase one was signed, I think China was very clear. They were going to buy what they needed to buy. And I think if you look at the statistics over the last couple of years and look at China purchases now relative to trade war, you see that everyone's trade is up. It's not just the U.S. that's up substantially. So is Brazil. So is, down that list I showed earlier. Everyone's trade has China is buying a lot. They were buying a lot largely. And again, remember that 2020, a couple things were happening. China was recovering from African swine fever. They were rebuilding hog population. They were importing a lot of feedstuffs, and they got right back on track very, very quickly. And agriculture, remember that despite all the other disruptions in world trade markets due to COVID, agriculture actually did pretty well. Ag volumes were up in 2020, 2021, and continue to be up now. I think China is going to continue to buy largely. The biggest concern I have right now is the Chinese economy and whether or not we're going to see not so much a downturn, but remember, this is a country that for years was having double-digit growth in GDP, big increase in per capita consumption of meat and dairy and other products that had knock-on effects for demand for feed and protein meal, and all that to see the economies flatten a bit. I think that's a bit of a concern, although hopefully they'll come out of it quickly. And I mean, China really has been an engine of global growth, for the last several years, and with this over the last year or so with the lockdowns and other things, that's been a big concern. So that's my biggest concern. But again, I have no doubt that next year we're going to see China as our #1 trading partner. I mean, I don't think that's a question. The question in my mind is whether or not the growth that we've seen over the last few years will continue at quite the rate that we saw.
Good, thank you, Joe. Dr. Dong, one of your charts had an interesting graphic showing increased consumer-oriented ag imports, and just curious if you have any maybe examples, 2 or 3 examples of things that are trends that are occurring. And I look at it from maybe the U.S. lens and how we can maybe be a provider of some of those different consumer demands that are occurring. Any thoughts on that, or anything you might guide us toward?
And so you mentioned the imports from China to the United States, sorry?
Yes.
Yes, and as mentioned, the increased imports from the United States, I think the phase one agreement makes a lot of contribution to the growth during the last 2 years under the background of COVID-19. And from except PIE has a calculation of the real imports from China of the United States of the implementation of phase one agreement, and also we also have a similar research. I think the phase one agreement just set a lot of huge impulse from the United States. I think the agriculture is one of the most important items. As some people asked, was to see the phase one agreement and mentioned the managed trade. I think for the term of managed trade, this is the first appear in 1980s, is during the period of China, during the Japan-US trade conflicts. As a trade economist, I don't think the managed trade with a target of impulse is the best, the optimal things. Since with the import targets, it can quickly increase the impulse and reduce trade imbalance. But maybe this is not market oriented. And so I think in the next period, in the phase one, after phase one agreements, in the next phase two agreements, we can reach some more market oriented mechanisms. But as for China, we still hope to have impulse in US goods, especially some agricultural goods.
Very good. Thank you. Hey, Lee, I'm going to turn to you because we talk about this occasionally in trade policy. Todd Gleason threw a question out. I'm not going to wait to do Q&A to the end. I'm going to kind of intersperse it throughout our conversation. On trade policy, he mentions that there's no agreement over intellectual property, or largely no agreement. It's been elusive. Any thoughts on how to create common ground between the U.S. and China on intellectual property? And as you and I know, particularly on some seeds that we have patented or we have proprietary rights, we want to protect those. But any thoughts on what could be done to bring back something to government officials on how we could improve our trade policy on intellectual property?
Well, Jim, I'm not an IP expert, but I think from my perspective, right, there's been long-running concern about the security of proprietary information that's developed, this intellectual property, and I think it goes a bit both ways. But I think that from a producer's perspective, but I'll also put on my investor hat, because I think was mentioned earlier, I'm also a partner with you in the Open Prairie Private Equity Fund, and as we invest in companies, that's one of the things that we always explore is the intellectual property, the patent rights that the companies had, and how secure is that on the global stage? Because if it is not secure, then it is great risk to everyone involved, the company, the investors, the producers, and the ongoing trade relationships. And there's been some rather, I guess I'd say, high profile events. I hope they're isolated events, but it will be an ongoing concern as long as we live in a global community. I mean, I know we share a bit of the same concern with Russia. I mean, it's been a long-standing problem with Russia, attempting to hack into the U.S. Systems and take, in essence, intellectual property as hostage on it. And it's a very disruptive thing for business in general. I mean, I'm sure Dr. Glover, Joe, you probably have additional, and Dr. Dong, additional perspectives on this as well.
Joe or Dr. Dong, any thoughts?
Yeah. Let me just say, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think this is a very serious issue. It's a very serious trade policy issue. I do think, however, it's a multilateral issue. I mean, this is something that yes, it should be brought up anytime we have bilateral discussions, but in terms of disputes over intellectual property and other sorts of things, there's a forum for that, and we really should be utilizing it, and that's at the WTO. I do think, this is one thing I was critical of the phase one agreement, just in the sense of I didn't like the managed trade aspects of sort of setting targets and things like that. But actually, there's a whole chapter in the phase one agreement that has provisions that are much more standard trade policy advances. So one thing that U.S. continues to be concerned about, but that there was progress made by dint of the negotiations over phase one, was the approval of varieties and other sorts of things for sale in China. And I think that actually a lot of progress has been made there, and was the result of several years of negotiations, I might add. But again, when it comes to disputes, I think they're yes, absolutely, raise them bilaterally. But remember that we also have a multilateral institution that is set up actually to help that. And China is shown to be, in the WTO, to be a very to be very compliant with rulings that have been brought before the dispute settlement system.
Dr. Dong, any thoughts on the intellectual property issue?
Yes, as mentioned, that in the phase one agreement, there is a chapter relating to intellectual property rights, and also China also confirmed to other higher level agreements like CPTPP, and also started other free trade agreements with FTA chapters, and make some changes of laws and some rules. And it is in China's own interest to promote innovation at this stage. And so it's our own interest to development and strengthen the intellectual property rights. So China is now taking various measures to strengthening intellectual property protection. Except laws, I think implementation is also important at this stage, for not only good for the U.S., but also this is good for all development and to protect international firms and also Chinese owned high technology firms.
Good, thank you.
Jim, I'd like to add one additional point to this. In addition to the intellectual property, in agriculture here today, in the United States, and I'm sure other countries around the world, we are gathering immense volumes of data. It grows exponentially every year. And again, I know as a producer and my fellow producers around the United States, one of the biggest concerns we have is the security and safety of that data, that data property. Who has access to it, and how will it be utilized? And again, I think this is going to be a continually growing issue because, again, the volumes of information is immense and just continues to grow. That is valuable trade information.
Great point, which kind of leads to my next question about food security and trade. And before I do, I think for those that are joining us for the first time, a little bit about the USCA. We're a region of 20 states, basically so the center of the United States from Colorado to Ohio and everything north and south of those two states. If you combine the 20 states, we have 430 Fortune 1000 companies headquartered in 84 of the cities within that Heartland region. And if you just took the national GDP of our region, those 20 states, it would rank first in the world. If you remove our region from that analysis, the European Union would be number one, China would be number two, and the other 30 states of the United States would be third. So it's a powerful entity. This represents a powerful opportunity for us to influence what we do on the national and international stage. But Lee, I might turn to you on the food security issue, because I think there's two kind of elements here. There's a question that came in from one of our guests tonight on Ohio, and that there are roughly 71,000 farms that are farming just short of 14 million acres for an average of about 200 acres a farm. The concern is to feed the billions of people in the world, that how do we maintain the family farm, which I know that my farmer friends think that that's part of their food security responsibility versus going to a factory farm approach. So maybe there's two issues there, Lee, maybe about food security and what we can do, and then also how it impacts at the producer level in protecting the food security issues that we see today.
Well, Jim, certainly. I mean, the United States is still a major producer of global commodities and a huge exporter. So we rely on these markets. And if you look at the history of production agriculture here in the last 4 decades, last 40 years, my involvement, producers have gotten larger or smaller. There's fewer producers in the middle. And Joe, I know you did analysis. Your office did analysis on this on an annual basis when you were at USDA. And that trend is going to continue for large commodity producers in the United States. Just the efficiencies of size, equipment capabilities today indicate that that's going to continue. But on the issues of food security, I mean, and it's an interesting discussion on domestic food security here in the U.S., because we still have a segment of a small percentage of our population that are undernourished here in the United States. And the issue of food security is very important to them. Access to high quality food. And so there is a push, and USGA is very much a player in this, to ensure that here in the United States, local communities, inner city communities that are in essence food deserts, have access to good quality food. So, and it's interesting, there's a number of smaller producers that are coming on board to produce these types of food products direct to consumer. Consumers today are very interested in knowing where their food comes, how it's grown, what's on it, and that's all around food security, health, and nutrition. And so while in the last 40 years we've seen a divergence, there's an important role for both large producers and small producers here, at least in the United States, around the issue of food security, both domestically and globally.
Great, thanks, Lee.
Jim, can I follow on something
please.
Lee just said? Because I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that certainly when we look at, what we think is going to happen over the next 10, 20 years, I think the one conclusion everyone has is that the dependence on imports is going to increase. I mean, there's just no way. Trade has become increasingly important for food security reasons, largely because you have a lot of areas where you have very high populations that just don't produce enough food to feed themselves. And to go down the route of, say, self-sufficiency or some turn their back on trade is just too expensive of a proposition. So I think the world is going to get even more closely linked with trade, particularly when you look at things like climate change and so shifts of production and other sorts of things. I think the world's going to be even more dependent. But the thing I would say about the U.S. is remember that even though we have large farms, they are family operated farms for the most part. It's very small percentage of farms that are corporate in the sense of having shareholders and other aspects. You may have farms that are an LLC or other sorts of things, but these are family farms for the most part. And I don't think that that structure is going to change anytime soon.
Good, thank you. You know, one of the things I think is interesting in the Q&A, as well as the Belt and Road policy of China and some of the investments China's made in, particularly into Sri Lanka, and some of the recent food security issues Sri Lanka has faced. You know, what maybe Dr. Dong, you could address, you know, from your view, what do you see happening from the Belt and Road investment perspective in shortening supply chains for China and, you know, other parts of both Asia and Europe and beyond, and how might we as American producers think about that and the impact upon U.S. exports to China?
Okay, so as for Belt and Road, I think from Chinese side, as economists will only see this is a broad framework or an agenda, but not very specific strategy, since a lot of things, this covers a lot of things about development. So as for China, this I think is not very specific targeted strategy. But now currently we can see some changes about Chinese side that we now propose a global development agenda. This is more now this is more open and hope to more developing countries to gain efficiency of development. So I think yes, this is a more open regionalism. This is not like some small clubs, and I think it will benefit in other countries, not a negative effect to the United States.
Good, thank you. You know, I'm kind of watching the clock. We're running a little behind our schedule, but that doesn't matter because we have a lot of questions here. So I'm actually going to invite two of our guest VIPs to join us that also will come on and address some questions. But if I could have Jason have Paul Schickler join us and Rajiv Singh. We're going to ask them also to address some of the questions that we have before us. Paul, do you want to give a brief intro?
Sure. Just a second, I'm getting my screen organized here. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you fine, yes.
Okay. So yeah, Paul Schickler. I'm retired now, but had a career with Pioneer Hybrid, then DuPont Pioneer, and then ultimately Corteva. The last 10 years of my work was as CEO of DuPont Pioneer. And even now in my 5 years of retirement, I work, getting my video going here, getting my feet wet and active in the startup community, primarily focused upon agricultural technology, and remain very connected to activities in China. I might mention that in my career at DuPont Pioneer, I did work in and with China for about 20 years during that time.
Great, thank you. And Rajiv Singh, you're on mute. You want to come off mute and give a quick intro?
Sure, thanks, Jim. This is Rajiv Singh. I've been an investor in the food and agriculture sector for the last about 20 years. A lot of that with a Dutch institution called Rabobank, where I was the CEO for North America for them. And then more recently, I've been investing alongside Jim, you know, in emerging opportunities in food and agriculture. We're very happy to be a part of this group.
Great. Well, thanks for joining as well. We have a question that came in from Savannah Riley on China and Brazil working together to develop a corn trade program. Maybe for Paul and maybe Lee, how do you see this impacting American producers if Brazil and China develop deeper collaboration? Paul, any thoughts on that?
Well, sure. And, you know, that is pretty relevant. It's probably been a topic or an issue that's been in front of us for now 5 or 6 years. And in fact, I was in China, in Beijing, when the trade disputes first were initiated. And in the conversations that I had at that time, so this is again about 6 years ago, in the conversations I had at that time, high-level individuals within China were reluctant, or maybe a better word to say it is they had regret that so much of their imports of corn and soybeans had been dominated by the United States. And now with the trade dispute in place, that was presenting problems for their own future. As well, there were Brazilian delegates there, and they were actively building up their own capability to produce corn and soybeans for the needs that China has, and build the infrastructure that's necessary both in the country as well as to enable those exports to get to China. So my point is that China is looking to be more diverse in its source of imports, and other countries are stepping up to fill that need. And that does therefore represent a very significant challenge for United States producers now and going forward, is how do we regain a better status in a relationship with trade with China, and how do we improve our competitiveness given the way it has deteriorated in the last 6 years.
Lee, any thoughts on that as a producer on China and Brazil? Or
Yeah, well, and Jim, I'm not an expert on this, but what little I know, I mean, this is born out of, I think, an issue that stems from the Ukraine being unable to export corn in the last 5 months. Granted, they're coming. It's interesting to note of the first 16 ships that have left Ukraine, most of them have been corn. I think there's only been 2 ships that have carried wheat out. And there's been some sunflower oil that's gone out, but it's mostly been corn. But I mean, this deals with the sanitary agreements and protocols, I think, that the Brazilian or that China has on the Brazilian corn relative to some of the fungus and weed control that the Brazilians utilize on their second crop corn, which weren't monitored. So again, to me, it's a bit of a confusing situation. I see Joe nodding your head. Yes, maybe you've got more detail on this, but it certainly is a trade related issue.
Yeah, no, and they certainly just to kind of tie the two thoughts together, that back when the trade war started, there was some thought about going to China, but again, because of those trade dispute, or from China going to Brazil for corn, but because of those restrictions, they did not. They did have Ukraine as an alternative, however, and Ukraine actually over the last 2 or 3 years has supplied a lot of corn to China. But again, like a lot of countries around the world, people are scrambling with a lot of that grain having been backed up in Black Sea ports, and even now, even though it's moving, it's not moving very fast. So we saw the Europeans do the similar sort of thing with Brazil corn, allow corn to come into Spain this year, because again, they were unable to get corn from Ukraine.
Rajiv, on the topics we covered earlier before you came on, we covered a fair amount on trade and climate, and your role at Rabobank. You touched all parts of the globe in finance. What is kind of your perspective on the trade opportunities between China and the U.S. and particularly as relates to the background you have, and maybe some of the things that we might have missed, if we did miss any, that could be done to improve upon the trade issues between our two countries?
I think all the macro trade issues, I think there's been a very good discussion on those. I think the one that I would like to kind of maybe bring in slightly is it's an indirect matter, but it's about corporations, large corporations that operate in the food and agriculture sector. So if you look at the largest ag company, Syngenta, is owned by China. One of our largest hog producers, Smithfield, is owned by Chinese shareholders, and that's sort of there was a lot of kind of trend over the last few years that that was moving towards China taking an active interest, or Chinese entities taking an active interest in corporations that were important for their food security, whether that was inputs in the case of Syngenta, whether that was actually sort of protein in the case of Smithfield. But obviously that has slowed down tremendously. So I just want to kind of hear perspectives from both sides as to whether because that's the biggest lever. That's how capital is deployed, and food products and technologies improved. So are we going to see anytime soon a kind of a more normalization of where sort of corporations can act sort of seamlessly across borders? Because I think that has definitely changed over the last few years.
Yeah, it's interesting, Rajiv, that I think it was a week ago, South Dakota put in some potential restrictions on farmland ownership, and there seems to be an increased, at least a conversation about that in various states. So, to your point, I think more barriers are not necessarily a good thing for us to have better collaboration. We have another question from Dr. Wendong Zhang, who's with us this evening. He has a two-part question for Dr. Glauber and Dr. Dong. It reads, I have two follow-up trade policy questions for the two of you. The first part of it is, how much reduction in non-tariff barriers do you see as a result of the phase 1 deal? And then in absence of the phase 1 deal, how can U.S. China ag trade, or how would U.S. China ag trade look like because of other factors like Chinese African swine fever? So two-part question, what non-tariff barriers have come off, and talk about African swine fever. Dr. Glauber, I'll point to you first.
Okay, well, Dr. Dong actually may be able to help with some of it. I mean, I think that, again, I mentioned this Chapter 3 in the agreement had a number of provisions on things like equivalence and for SPS things, dispute settlement procedures for SPS disputes, approvals for genetically engineered varieties, other sorts of things that we're supposed to expedite those. I don't know I haven't monitored it that closely. What I have looked at, and I haven't been to China since then, well, not obviously, but I haven't. What I have looked at is trade, and trade seems to be up, across the board for products. Now, I don't know. Again, I think China's buying a lot, and they're not buying. It's just not the U.S. from whom they're buying. They're buying from everyone. So I think that I think that in the absence of the phase 1 agreement, I think we would have had very, if you look at what they've been buying from everyone else, I think it indicates that we still would have had very robust trade with China. And I think the best thing that could happen right now is to normalize the tariffs and get rid of all these supplemental tariffs that are currently on the books, because that's to me, the real problem that hangs over all this discussion right now, is we still have these extraordinary tariffs that really would shut down trade if they were actually to go into effect.
Dr. Dong, any thoughts on the two-part question?
Yes, in the phase 1 agreement, there are 8 chapters, and some chapters like first chapter, intellectual property, second technology transfer, and other, so there are 2 parts of the phase 1 agreement. One is the targeted trade targets, that's imports that China has fulfilled nearly more than 70% of imports targets. And also for the other chapters like intellectual property and technology transfer, and China has accordingly changed some some laws and make some actions. You can also refer to the USTR report that there's a lot of various annual reports. It mentioned a lot of progress of China's actions. And also, from China's side, we not only follow phase 1 agreement of non-tariff barriers, and also we have finished agreements with the EU, that is CAI in China investment agreement. This is like a little more restrictions, like a little like a phase 2 agreement in other chapters. So it's more difficult for China to fulfill, but this is China's future direction. And also currently China just make a lot of reforms in free trade zones. There are 21 free trade zones, and in these areas they want to make some institutional reforms. And most of the areas just studied the CPTPP agreement and followed the requirements. So I think though it is difficult to estimate, since this is non-tariff as not exact numbers, but China has made a lot of steps in this area. And especially in the Brisbane Agreement in Chapter 4, this is for the opening up of financial services, in financial services industry opening up. So from the first day of the agreement, make actions, and China has fulfilled the obligations in this chapter.
Very good, thank you. You know, Rajiv and Paul, I might ask the two of you about African swine fever. We touched upon that briefly, but you know, there's been discussion about feed rations being changed, and particularly moving to synthetics. And Rajiv and you and I have talked about animal feed in different ways in the last year or two. Maybe Rajiv, what perspective do you have on African swine fever and how that might change import opportunity for U.S. producers?
I mean, I think the main thing is it's been a few years. There's been a lot of lessons learned, and that's where sort of I go back to some of the large producers, some of the ones that sort of U.S. entities that made investments in China that had to cull almost all of their all the animals in those 2 years. I think they have learned a lot of lessons in terms of better practices. So I think the biggest thing is is about making sure that those best practices are adopted, and regulatory kind of requirements sort of cover the maintenance of those those practices across the board. So I think that China did a really good job of that. So I think that's, I would say, more than anything else, it is making sure that those best practices are both sort of adopted, disseminated, and then kind of have a framework for compliance and regulatory maintenance of those. Then I think, sort of coming back to feed, yes, I mean there's a lot that has been done and can be done, in terms of having specific properties in the feed that will have, for example, some antibodies. Now, I don't know specific to swine, but we have looked at companies that are doing that in the case of poultry, where the feed, itself has properties that lead to the generation of antibodies against some of the most common pathogens. So I think those are the kinds of things where I think the collaboration amongst people who are operating on the ground in terms of big producers, but also academic institutions, can be very helpful.
Good, thank you. Paul, any thoughts on the African swine fever issue?
I don't have anything to add to what Rajiv just said, but Jim, if I could, I've got another thought and a related question, and the question might best go to Susan, if I could do that. Okay.
Jason, can you open up Susan to get her back online?
Is she ready?
She's
Okay. So Joe made a good point just a moment ago about the cloud of tariffs hanging over relations between the United States and China, and the impact that has on trade. My observation is that, while this really was initiated 60 years ago under a Republican administration, it is now really the other side of the aisle that has jumped in as well. And so now we have a Democratic administration also, you might say, piling on to the U.S. China disagreements and trade issues. And if I look at the political environment, I see no one or no party or no organization that wants to, you might say, change the direction of the dialogue and the discussions, because it is sort of the, it's the politically safe and current atmosphere to just pile on the U.S. China disagreement and not do anything constructive to initiate a change. So my question to Susan is, what are your thoughts there? And is there anything that can be done to send the climate in a better direction than it has been for the last 6 years?
Well, I'll start, and then I see Dr. Glauber nodding his head, so maybe he can add something, particularly on the sort of prospects for trade policy developments between the U.S. and China. But I do, have a lot of concerns about recent developments, in particular with respect to Taiwan, because that's always been a very sensitive issue between the U.S. and China, and we've got to get that right. We've managed it well for 40 years. We can't blow it now. So I think that's very important. But I do think it's a good sign that it seems that they're working to engineer an in-person meeting between President Biden and President Xi Jinping for November, which would be after our election and after the 20th Party Congress in China. So we both have a bit of, a very heated kind of political atmosphere in both countries right now, which is not going to be conducive, I don't think, to making progress on these issues. There may be some, behind closed doors discussions about the trade issues, but those are even difficult to have in this politically heated atmosphere right now. So I hope that after November and after this face-to-face meeting that we'll see some progress on these tariffs, which I haven't heard a single business in the United States advocate for, and no economist who says that they're benefiting U.S. consumers.
Great. Thanks for the question, Paul, and Susan, thanks for jumping back on. Maybe with the limited time I have, I'm going to ask you a question you aren't prepared for. So hopefully you all can turn on your microphones, and Susan, stay on as well. But the question is, you picked up a lamp on a beach and you rubbed the lamp, and out came a genie, and the genie said, you get one wish to solve the China-U.S. Trade issues. Dr. Glauber, what would you do? 10 seconds. What would you do to if you had one wish to change the trade issues?
I'd first fix the dispute settlement system at the WTO and start bringing trade disputes. If there are trade disputes, let's do them the right way and adjudicate them and bring them there.
Perfect. Dr. Dong, 10 seconds.
So I think it's better to have concrete agreements in next stage.
Great. Susan, how about you? Oh, excuse me. Susan?
Yeah, I'm excited to see the rollback of tariffs in the context of some, small deal that brings the sort of phase 1 to an end, and let's move on to either multilateral negotiations or bilateral or WTO. I'm a big supporter of WTO as well. So move on to the next stage.
Good. Lee, you got the lamp. What's your wish?
My wish is, again, I'm going to just speak from a producer lens. I've heard about all of my life about having a level playing field in trade. And I would love someone to explain to me exactly what that level, where's the starting point on a level field of play?
Paul, how about you?
I'd get the politicians and the political parties out of the trade disputes and let businesses get to good outcomes. I worked, like I said, 20 years in China. And while we had legal issues, intellectual property issues, cultural issues, businesses always figured a way to get things done.
Fantastic. And Rajiv, you for last.
I think Paul's definitely stole what I would have said, but I do want to go back to saying moving it from a bilateral issue to more multilateral issue, and WTO is already a platform that if we use properly and if it's fixed, if the issues are fixed, I think that's the hope that I have.
And Rajiv, next time your wish is you're going to go first. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. I have one assignment for everybody that's still on the call with us tonight. Please click on and become a member of the USHCA. We need your support, or make a donation to USHCA. It's a tax deductible donation. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Min. But before I do, thank you all for joining me tonight. I hope it was informative for those that were in attendance. Back to you, Min Fan.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, our panelists, and thank you, Paul and Rajiv, for joining as special discussant. And thank you, Ambassador Quinn, Susan, and Governor Holden. And also, I want to thank Dr. Dong joining from Beijing, and also our partner, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, for continuing to bring speakers to our forum, continue the dialogue. Thank you very much, and good night and good day, and have a good rest of the week. Bye-bye.
Bye.